Tonight, Mary will share with us about from the Dante Divine Comedy to see the later stage of individuation, and it's quite challenging topic. And I'm glad that Mary will share that with us. Uh, tonight, supposedly, Mary will give a 40-minute talk, then 10-minute break, then 40-minute talk, then Q&A. But maybe because we are our delay, so I think it depends on Mary to see how to regulate the new schedule. Yeah, thank you, Mary. Please, yeah.
Thank you, Howie, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to your friends in China, my friends in China, and some of my friends in other parts of the world. I want to begin by thanking Diane Stanley for the original paintings that she made that I will show in the course of my lecture among the slides. And they're very contemporary paintings, and they're very moving, I think, and they add a lot to the texture of this lecture. I should say the reason I'm giving a lecture on Dante, Dante's Divine Comedy right now, is that this is the 700th anniversary of his death, 2021. He died in 1321 in Ravenna, Italy. And throughout Italy now and many other parts of the world, his legacy is being celebrated. And so that's the reason that I'm focused on Dante this year especially. And I've been studying Dante quite intensively for the past couple of years now. So I'll begin by putting my slides up. And sharing with you an outline of what I'm going to present. The title is A Journey Through Realms of Shadow to the Mystery of Transformation, Dante's Divine Comedy, a drama of individuation in 3 acts. And on the screen you see the outline of my lecture. And we'll do the first 3 parts, and then take a break, and then do the second 3 parts after that, and then have some time for questions and discussion, I hope, at the end. So as I said, this year is the 700th anniversary of Dante's death. And in recognition of his immense and unique contribution to human culture, I have made his Divine Comedy my constant companion for some time now. I've read it in several English translations, and with ever increasing wonder at the psychological depth of this work of art. And I now more than ever appreciate and understand the immense dedication of the many distinguished scholars who have spent their entire professional lives studying this work. Once you're hooked by the magnificence of the Divine Comedy, you will never again be free of admiration and its allure and sheer brilliance. Dante captures and recasts the entire known world of his time in his poem. It is a work unique and astonishing, like the Lord God's creation of the world in 6 days. Dante, in a masterstroke of imaginal genius, transformed the entire classical and Christian worlds into a personal artifact with his inimitable signature. Dante's world is not so different from our present world, in certain respects at least. The divisions he suffered in his political and social environment in Florence, Italy, we can easily identify in our contemporary world. The absence of love the dominance of power seeking, the longing for justice. These we share in common with him. Dante finds a solution to his dilemmas by taking an unusual route. He goes on an inner journey. The Divine Comedy is a fascinating account of psychological and spiritual development. It is this developmental feature of the poem that I am interested in highlighting. Introduction. In his late work, Mysterium Conjunctionis, C.G. Jung describes 3 stages of a developmental process that takes place typically in the second half of life. It begins in a psychological crisis at midlife, which shatters the previously honed persona with its finely attuned cultural attitudes and its dedicated orientation towards specific goals of social and professional achievement. Often this crisis at midlife is initiated by a dramatic loss of a social or professional position, of a loved one, of an idealized person or cherished belief system, and a period of disorientation and disillusionment ensues. Jung experienced this crisis at the age of 37 with his break with his formerly idealized mentor Sigmund Freud. And Dante experienced it at about the same age, following his exile from his beloved city of Florence. Whereas Jung's individuation journey did not conclude until his death many years later at the age of 86, Dante's journey ended with his death at the age of 56 in Ravenna, shortly after completing the Divine Comedy. What I find in Dante's Divine Comedy is a singular account of a strange journey through the lands of the dead that yields up a remarkable story of individuation in the second half of life. It is a pilgrimage that clearly depicts increasing degrees of psychological and spiritual development, and not only awareness as the protagonist advances. The main character of the story, that is, the figure of the pilgrim Dante, experiences a journey of individuation, while at the same time, Dante the poet transforms this journey into a work of art. Like Jung, crafting his Red Book over more than a decade, Dante composed his Divine Comedy over a similarly long period of time. I have to go back. Between the years 1308 and 1321, as scholars have estimated. Although the experience he writes about took place, as he asserts, in only a few days, while he was in Rome during Holy Week in 1300, it took him the next 20 years to create the poem we know as the Divine Comedy. Dante's spiritual gift of visionary experience and his psychological transformation, and his remarkable literary gift as a poet go into making the work that we have before us. As a Jungian psychoanalyst, I'm looking at the Divine Comedy not primarily as art, but as a record of psychological transformation achieved through a process of what we today call active imagination. The epic poem is a record of an individuation process that begins at midlife in the state of confusion and darkness, a negredo state in the language of alchemy, then moves through a long series of imaginal confrontations with shadow figures and themes, and advances by rigorous psychological reflection and analysis to reach an albedo state. In alchemy, this is known as the whitening. Finally, it arrives at a rubedo state, the brilliant reddening in the alchemical process, which signals the appearance of the alchemical gold from out of the prima materia placed in the vessel at the beginning of the process. This transformation in the alchemical vessel mirrors the simultaneous psychological transformation of the alchemist in the poem of the poet. Dante is not only writing about a process, he is all the while participating in the process he is writing about. These stages of alchemical transformation correspond to the phases of individuation described by Jung in the final chapters of Mysterium Conjunctionis, the conjunction. Where he explicates the psychological meaning of the alchemical process described by the alchemist Gerhard Dorn. Dorn describes 3 stages of alchemical union or conjunctio as follows. Number 1, the separation of soul from body and the subsequent union of soul and spirit, creating a state called unio mentalis, with the body left behind and out of the picture. Second stage, the reunion of unio mentalis with the body, which transforms the body. And the third stage, the union of this synthesis of body, soul, and spirit with the unus mundus, a transcendental reality. I will argue that the Dante figure portrayed in the Divine Comedy achieves the state of unio mentalis by the end of the second canticle, Purgatorio. That's stage 1. He proceeds from there with the anima figure, Beatrice, who leads him through the levels of heaven to Paradiso, where his body becomes a subtle body, which represents a union of unio mentalis and body in a new synthesis, stage 2. And in his new body, Dante is not subject to gravity, and he casts no shadows. In heaven, he receives spiritual instruction from various illustrious teachers and undergoes a series of strict examinations that qualify him for the final numinous visions of the celestial rose and the Holy Trinity. It is beyond these that an electrifying moment of transformation occurs, which creates a permanent union with unus mundus. That's stage 3. The total result of his imaginal journey is psychological wholeness, as described by Jung. This is the psychological lens through which I am reading the Divine Comedy. The multitude of details in the narrative of the Divine Comedy are far too numerous to consider in the short space of this lecture. The selection of scenes and characters that I have chosen to focus on are what I see as some of the critical turning points of significance in the individuation journey depicted in the poem. I do not intend this to be primarily a psychobiographical study of Dante's personal, psychological, and spiritual development, but rather to consider the poem as a deeply instructive expression of a process that has archetypal underpinnings and whose movement is driven and ultimately controlled by the self. Without question, Dante's psychological development and his work were deeply intertwined, as was the case with alchemists and the transformational processes they were attending in the laboratory. The Divine Comedy is a testament to late-stage individuation as an archetypal process, but doubtless it is the story of Dante Alighieri's personal transformation as well. Act 1, Inferno. In the alchemical understanding of human nature, as expressed by Gerhard Dorn, there are three aspects: body, soul, and spirit. Initially, the soul has a natural inclination toward the body, and at the conception of a human being, it unites with the body and thereafter clings to the body compulsively. The second aspect of body that soul becomes attached and clings to is initially the mother. And this attachment becomes extended over time to include all of material and physical existence. It also includes one's social, economic, professional, and political life. The body, to which the soul is attached, becomes the whole horizontal dimension of life in the world.
在这个世界上的整个地平线。
The soul becomes attached to existence in the body.
灵魂会依附在存有的身体上。
I hear some talking there. Is that a translation?
Maybe. Let me see.
The soul becomes attached to existence in the body and the world through relationship. Initially to mother and father and family, later to the entire surrounding world of material objects, society and culture. Gradually or swiftly, depending on whether the personality is introverted or extroverted, the focus of consciousness enters into active engagement with the world through the senses at first, and then more fully through all the faculties of the conscious psyche. The soul becomes totally absorbed in all of this. Love and work, as Freud put it, and for a time knows of nothing else. This state is called by the alchemists unio naturalis, a natural union. And this is Dante's life before his crisis and his imaginal journey through the afterlife. He was fully involved in life as a man, as a prominent member of an important family in Florence, as a political figure in his beloved city, and as a courtly love poet of increasingly great renown. He was intensely attached and committed to his immediate world, and his energy was fully engaged in his daily activities. Body and soul, in the alchemical sense, were wed in a tight embrace. What remains out of this close union, according to the alchemical view, is spirit. Spirit is logos, in the high sense of the word, and connotes truth with a capital T, and ultimate meaning, as opposed to social or temporal meaning. Attachment of soul to body world brings a sense of meaning on the mundane and horizontal plane through being active in worldly affairs, career, family, business, politics, and so on. but it does not offer meaning in the vertical sense of ultimate meaning on the spiritual plane. The world of spirit hovers above this soul-body couple and is alien to it. The self, in the Jungian sense of the word, demands greater consciousness than is offered on the horizontal plane. Psychological identification with one's time, place, persona, and so forth is the natural result of development in the first half of life. And this is succeeded by further stages of individuation in the second half of life. It is this further development that the alchemist Gerhard Dorn refers to as the creation of unio mentalis, which is a union of soul and spirit, now with the body left behind. This stage of development requires, first of all, the separation of soul from body, pictured as death in alchemical imagery. The Divine Comedy opens dramatically, precisely at this moment of crisis. The poet wakes up in a dark wood, lost, and finds his way blocked by dangerous animals. He cannot get past them and return to his home and the familiar surroundings where his identity has been forged and located. In the opening lines of the Divine Comedy, Dante retrospectively recalls this terrifying moment. Midway in our life's journey, I went astray from the straight road and woke to find myself alone in a dark wood. Those are the opening lines of the Divine Comedy. Jung would speak, albeit somewhat reluctantly, of this critical moment in life to his young students at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology called the ETH in Zurich, speaking as one familiar with its psychological challenges. I want to thank Diane Stanley, particularly for these paintings that I'm going to show you as we go along. Quoting Jung, he said, "I really should not stress this turning point in front of so many young people. It does not concern them, and yet perhaps it is as well that they should know about it. A point exists at about the 35th year when things begin to change. It is the first moment of the shadow side of life, of the going down to death. It is clear that Dante found this point. When this turning point comes, people meet it in several ways. Some turn away from it, others plunge into it, and something important happens to yet others from the outside. If we do not see a thing, fate does it to us." Unquote. Well, Dante plunged into it, as did Jung when he went through the experiences depicted in his red book, the Liber Novus. Now, fortunately for Dante, a guide appears as he grows ever more desperate. The poet Virgil emerges from the shadows. He has been sent by an emissary, by Dante's beloved Beatrice, who has observed Dante's dilemma from her place in heaven. She has asked Virgil to go to Dante's assistance. The presence of Virgil will prove decisive in Dante's journey. Without Virgil, Dante would have remained lost and in a hopeless standoff with three threatening beasts who block his way to the summit. The beasts which represent powerful instinctive forces that block his progress, are obstacles, inner and outer. One is a lion, a symbol of pride, presumably Dante's own pride and also that of his opponents in Florence. The second beast is a leopard, a symbol of lust and hopeless attachment to the pleasures of the flesh, to which Dante was especially prone. And worst of all, is an insatiably hungry she-wolf sent from hell by envy, a symbol of avarice within Dante and in those around him in Florence. The she-wolf is never satiated and in fact becomes hungrier the more she eats. At this time, Dante found himself exiled from Florence, a city that had fallen into intractable political conflict between the party of the Guelphs, who supported the authority of the Pope in Rome, and the Ghibellines, who support the imperial authority of the Holy Roman Emperor to the north. Dante finds himself in the losing party and is forbidden to ever enter the city again on pain of death. He is baffled. Virgil makes a suggestion. Virgil says, he must go by another way who would escape this wilderness. And this other way that Virgil suggests will follow a descent into the darkest shadows of the underworld, and from there ascend to realms of transcendence beyond the limits of rational knowledge. This is what we would today call an individuation journey through the realms of the unconscious to the self. At the outset, Virgil gives Dante a map of the journey ahead. First, they will pass through the shadow world of hell, where they will see, quote, the ancient spirits tried in endless pain and hear their lamentation as each bemoans the second death of souls, unquote. In the Inferno, Dante records all the folly and weakness that humanity is heir to when locked into the compulsive and unrepentant, unreflected attachment of soul to body. Here the shadow is on full display in the form of the souls of the dead, who in life refuse to let go of the objects of their wanton passions, or even to attempt to free themselves from the force of their desires, and who now, as a consequence, suffer the dreadful results of their intransigence. They represent the psyche that resists the developmental movement from unio naturalis to unio mentalis in the second half of life. They are stuck and cannot move on to further development. Dante frequently feels sympathy for them. And who wouldn't? Isn't it natural to refuse the invitation to greater consciousness? This is the lamentable human condition, as everyone knows. Dante is also horrified at what he discovers. Were it not for Beatrice and Virgil, he might well be stuck here too, forever devoured by the she-wolf of avarice, the leopard of lust, and the lion of pride. Among the most poignant scenes that Dante encounters as he travels through this initially dark world of the afterlife occurs in the second circle of hell, where he comes upon the adulterous lovers, Francesca and Paolo. Francesca is a sympathetic image of a soul's passionate attachment to the body of her desire. She reminds Dante of his own sensuality and love of the body. In sharp contrast to Beatrice, who also died young and was taken directly to the highest realms of heaven, Francesca is consigned forever to the dark chambers of hell. This is because she has refused to separate from her lover, the brother of her husband. The image of a beautiful young woman, she shows no remorse for her adulterous love for Paolo and lays the blame for the affair on romantic poets like Dante. Love seized Paolo first, she says, and she responded powerfully and kind. She says, love which permits no loved one not to love took me so strongly with delight in him that we are one in hell as we were above. Love led us to one death. The passionate love that has seized her is stronger than her will. Obsessive, sensual love is a folly hard for Dante to condemn. In much of his previous poetry, he sang the praises of courtly love, which celebrated precisely this type of amour, without any pangs of conscience. When Francesca tells him the touching story of how it happened that she and Paolo became lovers, while reading a poetic account of Lancelot's guilty love for Guinevere, and he hears Paolo quietly weeping nearby, Dante is overcome with emotion. He writes, as she said this, the other spirit who stood by her wept so piteously, I felt my sense reel and faint away with anguish. I was swept by such a swoon as death is, and I fell as a corpse might fall to the dead floor of hell. Dante faints, and as he identifies with the passion of the lovers. Now, after this, it is hard to move on, and yet he does so, albeit with obvious anguish. His steady guide, Virgil, who represents the presence of spirit, presses him to advance. The movement toward unio mentalis is assisted by, in Jung's words, quote, the help of the spirit, by which are meant all the highest mental faculties such as reason, insight, and moral discrimination, unquote. This is Virgil. And beyond that, Virgil will lead Dante to figures who represent, quote, a window into eternity and convey to the soul a certain divine influx and the knowledge of higher things, unquote, as we shall see in the figures of Beatrice and Saint Bernard in the third canticle, Paradiso. I'm reluctant to draw a parallel to psychoanalytic work, but the temptation is great to observe that Virgil functions much like an analyst who accompanies a client through retrospective shadow realizations. In studying the Divine Comedy, I've been fascinated by the figure of Virgil. I feel close kinship with the part he plays in serving Dante as witness, guide, and voice of encouragement when the anguish of guilt and shame mount like the furies that Dante feels all about him as he passes through the awesome gate into hell. I quote from the translation of the Divine Comedy, here sighs and cries and wails, coiled and recoiled, on the starless air, spilling my soul to tears, a confusion of tongues and monstrous accents toiled in pain and anger, voices hoarse and shrill and sounds of blows, all intermingled, raised tumult and pandemonium that still whirls on the air, forever dirty with it, as if a whirlwind sucked at sand. This resembles moments in analysis when the prospect of encountering shadows the shadow in its full reality is frightening to the client, and the reassurance of the analyst who knows this territory from experience has a soothing effect that allows the journey to continue. Similarly, Virgil explains the source of the voices crying out and urges Dante to continue on the way through hell and then into and through purgatory. It is a long and necessary journey through all the shades of shadow realization that precedes the eventual crossing over into the next stage. Why is this necessary? Why can't Virgil just find a way to bypass all this misery? Take Dante straight up to heaven, and once there, turn him over to Beatrice for a pleasant flight into his beatitude. The truth is that there are no shortcuts to individuation. In the now many years of working as a Jungian psychoanalyst, I have occasionally seen the unhappy consequences of this attempted leap over the shadow into what was claimed to be liberation or enlightenment or true self or higher consciousness. It is an aged, poor, sad story. The denial and avoidance of shadow does not eliminate it. Looking away from the problems presented by a threatening confrontation with the shadow looks like an easy solution in the short distance. But the person will later arrive back at the starting point of the journey. In fact, time may run out, and they will remain stuck in the shadowland of hopeless suffering and despair, like the souls Dante observes in the circles of hell. The separation of soul and body must be faced and worked through, deeply, painfully, patiently, in order to prepare the soul for the union with spirit in unio mentalis. But that is the work shown to the poet and his guide in Purgatorio. And we will go to Purgatorio after our short break, 10 minutes, okay?
那我们休息10分钟哈，大家10分钟后回来。10 minutes later, sorry. Yeah.
Did everybody manage to get in, Hawaii?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
If this is recorded, right? Can they watch a recorded version?
Yeah.
If they? Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, good. Okay, we can continue then, huh? So we come now to Act 2, Purgatorio. The exit from the shadow world of hell requires facing ultimately what Jung named absolute evil. This is depicted in the descent to its frozen bottom, where Satan dwells. It means looking absolute evil in the face, which is, as Jung writes in his late work, Ion, a shattering experience. Eine erschütternde Erfahrung, a shaking experience, shattering. When Virgil shows Dante the figure of Satan and tells him, "Now see the face of Dis. This is the place where you must arm your soul against all dread." Dante stammers, "Do not ask, dear reader, how my blood ran cold and my voice choked up with fear. I cannot write it. This is a terror that cannot be told." Some commentators have speculated that Dante nearly went mad at this stage. Virgil, the ever steady guide and emissary of the divine Beatrice, embraces Dante and holds him close to himself as together they slip down the frigid body of the emperor of the universe of pain, who jutted his upper chest above the ice, the text says. When they reach the level of Satan's thighs, their direction suddenly reverses, and the way down becomes the way upward. This dizzying turn at first disorients Dante, for now suddenly they are ascending, and they make their way upward through a narrow passage, where they find themselves at the top of the world. Hell is now forever beneath them, and the rest of the journey is an ascent into the light. This is the way into purgatory. Until now, Dante has been a mostly passive witness of the shadow figures who are locked forever in place in hell. He engages in conversations with the damned, but he is not required to take a more active part in the journey. Entry into purgatory, however, calls for his participation, for active commitment with consequence. At the entrance to purgatory, they meet Cato, the archetype of the moral hero from Roman times, who instructs them on how to proceed. After that, they come upon 3 large colored steps at the gate to purgatory, which call for heartfelt contrition, the white step at the bottom, confession, the black step in the middle, and ardor for good works, the red step at the top. Unlike hell, purgatory is a realm dedicated to moral change. As in hell, there is suffering, but here there is promise of advancing from level to level, culminating in access to heaven. In other words, there is hope. The shadow traits that must be confronted in purgatory are represented by figures who are being slowly and meticulously transformed. Whereas the passage through hell showed Dante the consequences of souls clinging compulsively to body, the journey through purgatory becomes a master class in shadow confrontation and transformation. And Dante actively participates in this class. In the antechamber to purgatory, they find the lesser sinners, the excommunicate, the lethargic, the unabsolved, and negligent rulers. In purgatory proper, they find 7 levels of more serious but still hopeful sinners: the proud, the envious, the wrathful, the slothful, the avaricious, the gluttonous, and the lascivious. Each type of moral turpitude must be transformed through the purgatorial process and replaced by the corresponding virtues. humility, mercy, peace, solicitude, generosity, abstinence, and chastity. Each of these successive processes calls for an additional degree of separation of soul from body and a deeper union of soul and spirit, moving the individual toward unio mentalis. Diagnostic terms for Jungian psychoanalysis, this involves transformation of shadow aspects and features of character disorders such as pathological narcissism and borderline tendencies. This is a statement of an ideal outcome. As anyone who has been in long-term analysis knows, this process of encounter with the shadow is an ongoing work and takes immense stamina and commitment. The ego's self-protective defenses resist violently. Purgatory is a place of salutary and meaningful suffering, unlike the eternal, grinding suffering that we see in the inferno. As the angel of God standing on the red stair at the top makes ready to allow the poets to enter purgatory, Dante is surprised. He writes, 7 P's, the 7 scars of sin, his sword point cut into my brow. He said, scrub off these wounds when you have passed within. These marks will be expunged as he ascends through the levels of purgatory, and their removal will serve as certification that he has achieved the corresponding virtues. This will be evidence that he has achieved a high level of unio mentalis. Accompanied by Virgil, Dante climbs successfully through all 7 levels of purgatory, speaking along the way at each circle with one or more of the souls located there and being slowly and painfully transformed. For them, it takes incredibly long periods of time, years or centuries. For Dante, it takes only a couple of days. The wounds on his forehead are washed away one by one, and he can advance. The treatment is swift and effective in Dante's case. He seems to get the message at each level, and thus finds himself released from the unconscious power that would hold him there. Finally, heaven is practically within their reach, and the 2 pilgrims can hear the angels singing in the near distance. But before Dante can leave this realm of purifying trials and enter heaven, there is a test by fire. Dante shivers with dread and is understandably reluctant to go forward as he vividly remembers a scene he had once witnessed of burned bodies. But Virgil reassures him, says, "My son, here may be torment, but not death." So hesitantly, Dante finally steps into the flames, and he writes, "Once in the flame, I gladly would have cast my body into boiling glass to cool it against the measureless fury of the blast. My gentle father, ever kind and wise, strengthened me in my dread with talk of Beatrice, saying, 'I seem already to see her eyes.' The ordeal in the refiner's fire is a defining moment in the forging of unio mentalis as a stable state of consciousness. It is a critical moment of transformation. The alchemists would have called this operation calcinatio, the treatment by fire that burns away the metal's dross and impurities. Following this ordeal, Virgil takes his leave. He says, "Expect no more of me in word or deed. Here your will is upright, free, and whole. And you would be in error not to heed whatever your own impulses prompts you to. Lord of yourself, I crown and mitre you." It's a moving blessing given by the older poet to the younger. Dante has arrived at a stage of development that frees him from the need for Virgil and for Virgil's further guidance. He is now on his own. It is the end of his analytic relationship. Act 3, Paradiso. When Dante leaves the realm of deep shadow as depicted in Inferno, the alchemical Negredo, he enters in Purgatorio, a realm where light once again prevails, albeit intermittently, the albedo state. Now, as he is about to leave Purgatory, he is met by Beatrice, who will take him into heaven, where the light of the sun rules steadily, everywhere, and in utter splendor, rubedo. Beatrice, once human, has in death become archetypal, and now in the form of a subtle body, she inhabits the realm of symbolic reality, the reality of the psyche. The anima now becomes his guide and will take him to the self. To join Beatrice in her transcendent world, however, Dante must undergo a further transformation. He too must assume the form of a subtle body. This transformation occurs toward the end of Purgatorio, when Dante is immersed in the river Lethe. Which washes away his past, memories of his past, especially his past sins and shortcomings. And then he must drink deeply of the waters of the river Unoe. Which restores his sense of self as primal essence, the original self as imago Dei. Here the figure of the pilgrim, Dante, achieves the full unio mentalis. His body, which until now has cast a shadow, changes into a subtle body that is transparent and no longer subject to gravity. Having achieved a state of unio mentalis, his soul is one with his spirit. And this unity has a new body. The instinctual body has fallen away. Having arrived at this state, Dante is prepared to follow Beatrice into heaven. Although Beatrice is a symbol of eros in the highest sense of the meaning of love, she speaks surprisingly in the exalted language of logos, as she instructs Dante and shows him the celestial, the essential structure of the universe. In this stage of his journey, Dante goes beyond memory and poetic imagination, as represented by Virgil, and he shows a type of imagination that is visionary and reveals the primal forms and structures of being. In short, the foundations of the collective psyche. This is the world of archetype per se, entry into which is assisted, as Jung writes, by, quote, the spirit which is also a window to eternity and conveys to the soul a certain divine influx and the knowledge of higher things. This visionary state is mediated by Beatrice. Dante's imagination resembles the type that Henry Corbin writes about and finds in the writings of the Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi. Corbin argues that this type of imagination reveals, objectively, the invisible spiritual world. Quote, this manifestation of God is neither perceptible nor verifiable by the sensory faculties. Discursive reason rejects it. It is perceptible only by the active imagination, at times when it dominates man's sense perceptions, in dreams, or better still, in the waking state. The place of this encounter is not outside the creator-creature totality, but is the area within it which corresponds specifically to the active imagination, in the manner of a bridge joining the two banks of a river, unquote. In the Paradiso, Dante engages this type of active imagination, which goes beyond metaphor and poetic imagination, transverses the limits of conscious mental capacity, and shows, as in darstellen, the German word meaning to represent, to display, to reveal, an ultimate mystery. Jung writes similarly about the numinous visions he experienced while recovering from a serious illness in his later years. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, Jung writes, I would have never imagined that any such experience was possible. It was not a product of imagination. The visions and experiences were utterly real. There was nothing subjective about them. They all had a quality of absolute objectivity. The objectivity which I experienced in the visions is part of a completed individuation. It signifies detachment from valuations and from what we call emotional ties, unquote. As Jung understands, this is advanced individuation, and it is what he writes about in Mysterium Conjunctionis as the full achievement of unio mentalis. What Dante describes in Paradiso is a revelation of the objective order of the cosmos and its fundamental energic organization. Beatrice's lectures here have a distinctly geometric and mathematical clarity and exactness, like a course in astronomy or physics, but they are delivered with a profound feeling quality of love. In this, she symbolizes the sublime reality of unio mentalis, the union of soul and spirit, of eros and logos, within the feminine form of a subtle body. Dante speaks of becoming transhuman, transhumanar in Italian, of becoming transhuman in this realm. In a sense, he and Beatrice are bodiless, but more precisely, they occupy an imaginal or subtle body, for they still have distinct form. They are figures of active imagination in Henry Corbin's sense of the term. The cantos of the Paradiso that lead up to the final supreme revelation describe in careful order the various realms of all creation. There is an ascent from a space named earthly paradise through the circles of planets and stars and on to the exalted Empyrean. Once there, Beatrice shows Dante the wondrous celestial rose, crowned by the Virgin Mary, and to which Beatrice holds a prominent rank. Then suddenly, Dante has a new guide, the famous medieval mystic and devotee of the Virgin Mary, Saint Bernard. It remains now only to experience the ultimate vision of the Godhead. Dante's educational lessons in Paradiso, as delivered by Beatrice, the apostles, and Saint Bernard, are all aimed at preparing him for this ne plus ultra, which is described in the 100th and final canto of the Divine Comedy. This is the scene in which the second and third stages of the Mysterium Conjunctionis, as outlined by Gerhard Dorn and expounded by Jung, are accomplished. The visionary union of unio mentalis with unus mundus, which is subsequently incarnated in a transformed man, the poet Dante himself. In Jung's view, this would, quote, consist, psychologically speaking, in a synthesis of the conscious with the unconscious, unquote. Initially, St. Bernard signals to Dante that he should follow, quote, the aura of the high lamp, one light which in itself is true, unquote. As the poet turns there and gazes steadily into that light, he has a glimpse of total unity, the self in Jung's terminology. He writes, I saw within its depth how it conceives all things in a single volume bound by love, of which the universe is the scattered leaves, substance, accident, and their relations so fused that all I say could do no more than yield a glimpse of that bright revelation. This is a vision of totality that takes all of history and its energic essence, love, in one single glance. Beyond this, as Dante gazes steadily into the light, some details emerge. He writes, within the depthless deep and clear existence of that abyss of light, 3 circles shone, 3 in color, 1 in circumference. The second from the first, rainbow from rainbow. The third, an exhalation of pure fire, equally breathed forth by the other 2. This vision of the Holy Trinity as 3 circling spheres then further differentiates, and Dante sees vaguely represented a human form in one of them. As he gazes deeply into this mystery, he wonders intensely how the human and the divine, how the human can enter the divine, and the divine the human, but he cannot think his way there. It is like trying to square the circle, he says. It is beyond his capacities, and he confesses, but mine were not the wings for such a flight. Yet, as I wished, the truth I wished for came cleaving my mind in a great flash of light. The mystic truth comes as experience, not as thought. This sudden flash of visionary insight marks the supreme high point of Dante's spiritual and psychological transformation. In the form of unio mentalis, he becomes entwined and merged with the ultimate ground of all being. Unio mentalis and unus mundus become one in this climactic moment of vision. The result is stated in the sublime language that only a master poet can inscribe in verse. If you read Italian, you can read it on the screen. Here my powers rest from their high fantasy, but already I could feel my being turned, instinct and intellect balanced equally, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars, by the love that moves the sun and the other stars. The poet cannot put into language what he saw in this vision, but he can state the transformative effect of this vision in his personality, where instinct and intellect balanced equally, as in a wheel whose motion nothing jars. He gazed directly into the reality of the self, where all is made one. More importantly, he experienced an incredible mystical union with the universal energy of the divine, and as a result becomes one with love. This marks the pilgrim's collective union, effective union with unus mundus. Individuation here has reached its final goal and is now complete to the extent that is humanly possible. Dante died on the night of September 13th, 1321, having just finished the final cantos of the Paradiso. Legend tells us that Dante was pointed out in the streets as a man who had somehow returned from a voyage to hell, as though he were a kind of shaman. One may add that in his poetic account of the journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven, Dante shows the readers of his poem just how far the process of individuation can extend. It begins in loss, confusion, and fear, negredo, then passes through penitence, reflection, and deepening of consciousness, albedo, and finally attains the goal of full psychological integration and spiritual transformation, rubedo. This makes Dante a psychological prophet in the biblical sense, of one who expresses a vision of the humanly possible. And he does so magnificently in the style of a master poet. The postlude. The outcome of the three-stage process of transformation as described by Dorn and interpreted by Jung is a transformed personality, as the Divine Comedy so movingly depicts in its concluding canto. As psychotherapists, given our experience in working with clients who are in the process of individuation, we might ask, to what extent is this a real possibility, given the postmodern times we live in? Maybe this is nothing more than a time-bound and culturally limited medieval fantasy. Or do deep psychological and numinous experiences, using active imagination, which are perhaps quite different in content, but similar in psychic power to what we find described in the Divine Comedy, still, even in our time, make a real difference in how people ultimately feel about life and themselves, or how they conduct their lives and behave toward others, and how they formulate the meaning of life for themselves in the final analysis. And does the effect of such experiences of active imagination last? We do not actually know much about how the imaginal journey through the underworld and the afterlife, that is, through the unconscious, changed Dante Alighieri, the man. Did he become what he depicts in the poem? There seems to be some evidence that he did change in his attitude and behavior from the romantic poet and engaged politician he had been in early life. Exile changed his outer way of life dramatically, and his profound inner work with imagination in his poetic efforts changed his inner life. Together, the changes, outer and inner, fell together to create a personality that we know as the great Dante. From our experience as Jungian psychoanalysts, we can testify that careful and sustained analysis of the shadow and the complexes of the personal unconscious, combined with consistent engagement with dreams and active imagination over a period of time, does make a lasting impact on the lives of our clients. We also know that analysis does not entirely remove all the effects of early traumas and the consequent complexes, even while it does strongly assist a person in outgrowing the debilitating psychic wounds and relativizing them. The establishment of the transcendent function and an ego-self axis on the inner level shifts the locus of control and interest from persona needs for prestige and power to a type of selfhood that brings with it a considerable degree of freedom and acceptance of self and others. And beyond that, there are experiences that give one a perspective on life that frames one's personal narrative in a more objective concept. This would testify to the veracity of Dante's claim that instinct and intellect can finally be coordinated and move in harmony with, quote, love that moves the sun and the other stars. I prefer to look upon the journey as described in the totality of the Divine Comedy, the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso, as a mandala that depicts the experience of the whole psyche. There are parts of the psyche that are forever frozen in place and will never change. The figures depicted in the Inferno. These are intransigent complexes that continue to exist even in advanced stages of individuation. There are other parts that can be transformed, like the figures in Purgatorio. These are amenable to change and capable of undergoing transformation. And there are numinous parts of the self in the archetypal realm of the psyche that are glimpsed from time to time in dreams, visions, and synchronistic experiences. These are the figures depicted in the exalted realm of heaven in Paradiso. Ego consciousness can locate itself principally in any of these realms from time to time, and may travel through all of them many times in the course of a long individuation process. It is possible that in later life, if a state of wisdom is achieved as described in Dante's poem, the predominant position will be fixed more or less steadily by the achievement of a union with Unus Mundus, and love and generosity will predominate. In a late life conversation with Zen master Shinichi Hisamatsu, Jung was asked a sharp question after they had spent a good deal of time comparing the goal of Zen Buddhism, which is liberation from all suffering, with the goal of analysis, which is psychological wholeness. They had agreed that freeing a person from the suffering caused by the complexes, personal and cultural, and even from archetypal influences was a common goal. The conversation then comes to a climax with this exchange. Hisamatsu: from what you have said about the collective unconscious, might I infer that one can be liberated from it? Jung: yes. And this response produced a gasp of surprise among the people present. It was an astonishing response given Jung's usually more modest estimations of human potential for individuation. What makes this important for our present reflection is that it suggests Jung's agreement that transformation of the type Dante describes in the Divine Comedy is psychologically possible, even if only for a moment. One can step out of personal history with its accumulation of complexes and cultural conditioning by bathing in the river Lethe, attain to a transformed sense of self by drinking the waters of Unoe, and even go beyond the most sublime archetypal images imaginable, Beatrice, the mystic rose, the Holy Trinity, and be struck suddenly by lightning. The Satori experience in Zen Buddhism, the ultimate numinous experience in the Divine Comedy, which transforms consciousness to such a profound degree that only the transcendent self and the energy of love rule over it. This is a tall order, but no doubt other mystical traditions such as Kabbalah, Sufism, and Kundalini Yoga would concur. Even if not often seen in the outcomes of the individuation processes unleashed and fostered by Jungian psychoanalysis, the vision in Dante's poem can serve as an inspirational image for pursuing the goal of individuation. Thank you. And now we can have some Q&A.
Yeah. And there's one in the chat room. Can you see it?
I don't see the chat room. Oh, there, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Adrian Davy.
The last one, what is the subtle body? How is it relevant to the clinical work? That one. What is the subtle body? I see a question that says, what is the subtle body and how is it relevant to clinical work? And I can speak to that for a moment. The subtle body is a concept that Jung writes about occasionally in several different places. And it has to do with imagination. What we call true imagination, or what Corban talks about as active imagination, Jung writes about as true imagination as opposed to frivolous wish fulfillment, fantasy type thinking. What true imagination creates are images that have a reality, a psychic reality. And it's a reality similar to what Winnicott writes about when he writes about play and transitional objects and transitional space. And what Winnicott says is you don't ask the question, is it real or not real? It breaks the space, it shatters it, it creates divisions. Jung says the same thing about the imaginal space, imaginal reality. And Corban would agree that there is a type of reality that can only be discovered through the use of imagination. Thinking of imagination as a cognitive function that takes us into regions of reality that are rational functions, or thinking function, or feeling function, so on, don't have access to. And so Jung was very convinced, and those of us who work in Jungian circles have had this experience as well, that those images have a power to transform lives, to change the way one thinks, the way one feels, the way one orients oneself in life, one's direction in life. So they have a psychic reality. And we call them, those images, subtle bodies. So their relevance to clinical work is that if you use active imagination in clinical work, you will come upon subtle bodies. And it's good to know about them and what they are and how to value them and how to think about them. Because you can easily dismiss them as nothing but fantasy material. Now, Jung came upon this realization through his own work. You can read about it in the Red Book, where he confronts Elijah and says at one point, "Oh, I can dismiss you, you're nothing but symbols." And Elijah looks at him and says, "You may think of us as symbols, but we are more real than anything else you know in the world. We are as real as anything else you know in the world." In other words, the symbol, Elijah, the subtle body of Elijah, puts himself on the same ontological level and plane as the material world. So what we call real depends on our attitude. Are symbols real? Is the subtle body real? Well, it is if you think it's real or you've experienced it as real. And what is real is what has effect. Was wirkt, as the Germans say, is wirklich. Was wirkt ist wirklich. What has effects is real. And so, yeah, we work with subtle bodies quite a lot. Sometimes dream images are taken up into active imagination, become subtle bodies. Sometimes in the transference, countertransference medium, in the space between, in the field of analysis, we can experience subtle bodies as images or as powers or effects or feelings. We can give them form and shape. We can paint them. We can work with them in active imagination and so on. So it's a very useful concept if you go deep in working with the unconscious in analysis. Could you define the words spirit and soul? When Jung talks about these two, he talks about the anima and the animus. Animus is a Latin word that means spirit, and anima is a Latin word that means soul. And soul is related to eros. Anima and soul are related to eros. Eros is a connecting function of the psyche. It links us and connects us, brings us into relationship. It attaches us to other people. We fall in love with them. We project on them. That's the soul at work. That's anima, creating networks and relationships in the world around us. When we love a project, or we love a political party, or we are deeply engaged and committed, pouring all of our energy into building a house or something, that's our soul's work in the world, and it's attached to the material world. That's its unio naturalis. That's where it belongs, and it doesn't depart from that world. But when it unites with spirit, something else happens. When unio mentalis takes place. Now, what is spirit? Animus, logos. It's logos in the sense of understanding, but beyond what we mean by scientific understanding or solving a puzzle or a problem. Say, oh, I understand how to fix the car now. I understand how to load that in my computer. I understand the network of the internet and so on. That kind of understanding of how things work is a normal way in which we speak about understanding. But logos in the high sense is what gives something its meaning. What is the meaning of something? A meaning has many different levels. You can say, it's meaningful for me to feed the animals. I'm committed to feeding the cat and the dog. That's a very meaningful activity to me, but it's not logos meaning. It's everyday meaning, or even high levels of meaning. It's meaningful for me to go and worship in a temple or in a ritual. That's a meaningful experience for me. That's a higher level of meaning. But at the highest level, what meaning is what Jung called supreme meaning, or ultimate meaning. It's what Dante gets at the end of his journey. It's the meaning of everything. Why does anything exist? What is the meaning of the universe? What is the meaning of human life on this planet? That's logos at the high sense. Then you're thinking like God thinks. God is logos in that sense, understanding and knowing the meaning of everything. Now, it's rare that we get there or have that vision. I remember waking up from a dream one time many years ago and thinking, wow, in that dream, I understood everything. I understood how the universe worked. And then I couldn't remember the dream, unfortunately. But there was a moment of experiencing high logos in a dream. Sometimes you read a text or you go on a walk and suddenly you have a flash that gives you an insight. And oh, that's the meaning of my life. That's why I was born. That's my existence. And that's a high level of meaning, the meaning of your life. It's not the highest level, but it is a significant level. So it's a ladder. Spirit goes up a ladder. Now, when soul joins spirit and takes an interest in this, it's like your main interest becomes meaning. That's the marriage of soul and spirit. That's what philosophers do. What is the meaning of things? Why does anything exist? What is the meaning of being? Being itself. But that's also what religions address. Why is there anything? God, only God knows. But when you fall in love with that sense of meaning, and you want to pursue it to its highest levels, then you rise to this degree of perspective that Dante reaches in heaven, where he starts seeing how everything fits together. And what he realizes in heaven is that everything is held together by two principles. The two principles are love and justice. Love and justice rules the universe, and he can see it with Beatrice. He sees how it works. And there's a tremendous vision. That's Logos at its highest level. When he reaches that point, and he's left his interest in this world, left the body behind, and he sees that. And that's what he comes back with. That's what transforms him. Now, what happens when he comes back? When you come back with that kind of experience into the body, into your life, you are changed. Dante was a changed man, we think, when he comes back into his body. And we think of this as realizing the vision or wisdom or becoming the wisdom. Simply by being with others, they can experience the balance, the unity, the harmony of justice and love and in your spirit, because you've gone through purgatory, you've been cleansed, you've joined with Logos, and now you can see far. You have a big perspective on things. As Jung says, you're released from emotional attachments. This is what the Buddhists speak about as detachment. It doesn't mean you're not interested or you're not connected or you're not still busy in the world, but you aren't attached in the old way. It isn't life and death, whether, outcomes of the football game or something like that. You can watch it with interest, but you aren't drawn into it in the same way. And you have a sense that it's meaningful to a lot of people and it has a purpose in society and so on. You get a bigger perspective. So spirit is meaning and soul is libido, love, interest. And where does that go? Does that go into bodily satisfactions, or does it go into a quest for an attachment to meaningful life? And that's the direction that Dante and many religious traditions take, that pilgrimage to those high levels of perspective and insight, but always return to this world and try to transform the world in a certain way when they come back. Dante was too old to do it. He died at 56. He was not well in his exile. And had he lived to Jung's age, one thinks that he would have done quite a lot more with his life in whatever way. It's hard to say. Let's see, is there another question? Adrian Davis says, I'm reminded of the phenomenon of the wounded healer, of which there are varying degrees all our lives. Also particularly interested in the necessity of to dismember those traumatic experiences that are unbearably painful in a person's life until they can be processed safely with a client. Yes, that's a very good point. What we do in analysis is try to digest the pieces of traumatic experience bit by bit as far as it is as the client's capacity extends. And you can see in Dante's journey, he doesn't get it all at once. He sees it in stages. There are levels that he goes down into, down in the inferno, 7 levels of depth till he gets to Dis or Satan and sees the absolute evil that is represented by Satan. So this confrontation with shadow awareness and with the complexes and experiences that we've had in life that have left us wounded or overly sensitive to certain places, things, people, those have to be dismantled bit by bit. You can't swallow that all at once. You have to use the beta function as, or the alpha function as Bion said, to digest the beta bits that get stuck in the psyche. So this taking apart piece by piece and slowly dismembering the complexes is certainly an important part of the process of analysis. I think I've covered the questions as I see them so far, Howe.
Yeah, there's the last one. Both Chinese and the Western culture have the similar kind of visiting the hell story. I'm curious about if there are any different or the meaning of going to hell between Western and Chinese culture in terms of individuation process. It's by Mei Liu. Okay.
Yeah, I think there are certainly the figures that represent hell and hellish forces, evil powers in Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism and other and Hinduism, and one has to get past those on the journey into nirvana. Or Jung commented on that in his commentary on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. I don't know that they're detailed in the same way. Dante's Divine Comedy has an incredible amount of detail. He's a supreme writer, and every line is interesting. It captures your attention. The details are really interesting. There are sections that have to do with his time a lot, like the names of characters that we know nothing about. You have to read in the footnotes. People that Dante knew, and he places or he finds these people in various positions, in like Francesca and Paolo in the second level of hell. He finds them there. He doesn't put them there. He discovers them there. He finds the popes in a deeper level of hell because the popes have been unjust and corrupt. Avarice has eaten alive the Holy See. The Vatican is corrupt. He puts the popes, or he finds the popes buried in hell upside down, their heads down into the ground. And when another pope dies, he's pounded down on top of the last one, and down they go. It's a tremendous expression of righteous anger and justice that takes place in hell. And sometimes it's a justice that we don't appreciate, or we wouldn't sympathize with, or we wouldn't agree with, like the condemnation of poor Francesca and Paolo for their love. I mean, we would let it go. We would say, okay, we understand that we're all vulnerable to that. But no, in the other world, justice is supreme, and we don't understand it. Dante doesn't get it for a long time until he gets into the higher levels of purgatory and begins to understand why the specific sinners are suffering as they are. And then when he gets to heaven, he realizes that justice is also guided by love, that they are linked. They aren't two separate principles, they're a linked principle. And that the delivery of justice is also a part of the love that rules all the stars and the sun and all the other stars. And it's a way of thinking. We long for justice today because there's so much injustice in the world. We see it all around us. It's in the newspapers every day. We cringe every time we turn on the television. What's happening now? The injustice is overwhelming. Well, in Dante's universe, justice is delivered, not in this life, which Dante experienced injustice, being exiled from his home city, the corrupt politicians, horrible people that he had to deal with. He understands that there's no justice in this world, but in the next world, there is justice, and it is absolute justice, and it will be delivered. So I think that was a consolation for the medieval person, that even though people get away with injustice in this life, justice will be served one day, and it will be served with absolute decisiveness and with love, because a world without justice is a world without love. Love and justice have to go together. Um, and that's what Dante, of course, learned from Thomas Aquinas and the theologians, but it's also what he sees and experiences in paradise, in heaven. And Beatrice is a wonderful example of, Beatrice was a young girl that Dante fell in love with when he was 8 years old. They were children. And he met her at a party or something. Families were connected. And then he met her once more when they were teenagers. I think he was 17 or 18. And he was still in love with her and he wanted to marry her. They married very young in those days. He was marriageable age, so was she, but the parents couldn't agree. And her parents married her off to someone else. And Dante was devastated by that. He lost the love of his life. But he coped and he fell in love with another woman, and he was married and he had some children and had some love affairs and wrote a lot of love poetry. But he always held her in the back of his mind. Now, she died at the age of 25 or so, and you would think, well, that's not just, that's not fair. A beautiful young woman dying in the prime of her life. But the justice is served in that she goes straight away to paradise, to the highest levels of paradise. In the mystic rose, she's sitting up there with the Virgin Mary and other saints. And she stays in contact with Dante as well. So the love that's between them from the time they were children is maintained. There is a kind of permanence about that love that, as there is a permanence about the love that Francesca and Paolo, but theirs was adulterous, theirs was wrong. It was sinful love. Dante's could have verged on that, but it didn't. And this love that he had for Beatrice is reciprocated, and she sees him from paradise and comes to his rescue. So this notion that love is eternal, that true love lasts, is a discovery that he makes on this journey. He'd lost contact with her completely. She had died, she was gone. Then when he gets stuck in the woods, in the dark wood, she sends Virgil, and she tells Virgil, I've seen my beloved. He's got a problem. Go and help him. So she delivers her emissary to Dante, who helps Dante on his way up to her level. And eventually they come together, but they don't unite in marriage or anything. Dante moves on beyond her to his final vision. Okay, Awe, I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, thank you. It's quite wonderful.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the opportunity. And I want to thank Diane Stanley again for the beautiful pictures that she painted. They're marvelous. I really like them.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. You should introduce her to everyone.
Yeah.
Stanley. Yeah.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. And thank you.